So this whole situation right here is funny. It almost feels like wrong to bring it up in a Topic Arlo video. It almost feels like it deserves like a main channel video. But we will talk about it today. It's really funny because everybody wanted to have a handheld. You know, Nintendo did really well with their handhelds. Sony tried handhelds multiple times, and it didn't really work out. The original PSP did over time end up being relatively successful, but mostly because people were using it for other stuff. And I don't really know. It's a little bit debatable. Even if that was fairly successful, then the next iteration of the PSP, the Vita, it did not turn out very well. Sony quickly abandoned the poor thing. There were always these ideas that maybe Xbox would try, maybe someone else would try. But ultimately, we kind of just reached a point where it felt like Nintendo had just won. They just had it, you know? They cornered the market on dedicated handheld devices, especially with the rise of smartphones. Once smartphones came around and the Vita didn't work out, it was just all right, there's really not room for more dedicated handhelds. So Nintendo just kind of had it. But in recent years, the whole conversation has gotten a little bit more interesting, because now we're starting to have devices that are not dedicated handheld platforms where you have to develop exclusively for them. With a handheld Nintendo device, you have to make games for it. Now we've seen this really big rise in just devices that just let you play and stream games from whatever, PC, like Steam, or just kind of whatever. We're kind of in a new era of multi-platform releases and overall flexibility. Obviously it took Valve a really long time to do any kind of real serious attempt at their own hardware that wasn't just Steam branded Alienware PCs or whatever. They released the Steam Deck, and you can play a lot of Steam games on the Steam Deck. And again, we've seen a lot of other devices coming out. And so now we're starting to get rumblings again of these big gaming companies, these Nintendo rivals, starting to maybe kind of think about dipping back into handhelds again. On the Xbox front, there have been rumors floating around about them trying a handheld for a good number of years now. And I don't know if a lot of that just comes from their overall just struggle in the hardware space. Xbox is always kind of just flailing and just trying to see what happens, see what works out. And then more recently, those rumors have started to get a little bit more strong. There have been these weird rumblings that Xbox might want to do a handheld of some kind, especially because they've got Game Pass. So for them, the hardware is not even that important anymore. They just want to get Game Pass on a bunch of devices. They just want people to pay for Game Pass. And in a lot of cases, they've been putting their first-party games on other platforms too. Just whatever. The hardware doesn't even matter. Just give us money in some form or another. And then on the Sony front, somewhat recently, they put out the PlayStation Portal, which plays games handheldedly, but it was only a streaming device for, playing your PlayStation games run on your PlayStation, but streamed to the device. So obviously that came with a lot of limitations. But that was kind of their most recent foray into handhelds. But it sounds like it was actually a pretty okay success. I've heard that it's sold pretty darn well, made them a pretty okay amount of money. And again, the Steam Deck has been doing pretty well. A lot of other companies are trying to make these little basically portable PCs you can play PC games on. And according to a Bloomberg report, Sony is now really seriously getting back into the idea of creating a handheld. A true, honest-to-goodness handheld piece of hardware that is running the games itself. The only difference, though, is that this is not planned to be, or rumored or report, whatever, it wouldn't be a dedicated handheld. And that's the really big difference here, is that this would be just like all the other non-Switch handhelds right now. It would just be something to play games in a handheld mode. In this case, PlayStation games. You'd be able to play them handheld. And that's a really big distinction, makes a really big difference. And I think the way that I understand it, the reason that now becomes a viable piece of hardware again is because when you have a dedicated handheld, you are making games exclusively for that handheld. You can't afford a small install base because then you have a very limited amount of people who can buy the games that have been developed for it. Developing games is obviously very, very costly. And so you don't want to limit their sales potential by putting them on a platform that itself doesn't end up selling super well. So like anything less than tens of millions of units is going to be considered, pretty much a failure for something like this. But similarly to the PlayStation Portal, or now the PS5 Pro or whatever, a new handheld would just kind of become another part of the ecosystem. It would just kind of be its own kind of extra item. It would be an extra piece of hardware for people to buy. Sony would make money on that piece of hardware. They would mark it up or whatever. Like, it would just be its own individual piece of thing to sell to people to make money on. And then, that could, in theory, incentivize more people to buy PlayStation games because, oh man, I didn't want to get a PS5, but now I can play them handheld? Oh, absolutely. I don't know how many of those people really exist, but even without that, I would imagine that you'd be able to play essentially any PlayStation game on this handheld. So again, it's all just part of the ecosystem. It just gets people buying PlayStation games, playing PlayStation games. And this especially makes sense because they're saying that this is probably years away. And even the stuff that's been said about Microsoft, Xbox making their own thing, it's all very early talks. And I have to wonder if Sony is only in the early talks to make a handheld because Xbox is in the early talks and they don't want to get left behind. I don't know. I don't know how much of this has to do with the success of the Switch and the Switch 2 coming. I don't know how much of this is them wanting to get in on the Nintendo pie, or if it really is, it probably mostly is just, sorry, I'm still coughing. It probably mostly is just because, like I said, the whole, just gaming ecosystem, multi-platform stuff, it's getting a lot easier, especially as graphics are topping out. Graphics have not been improving that much, and we're still getting so many cross-gen releases, just an unprecedented amount of them, because I think it's just easier than ever to run games on both platforms, to just kind of like scale them, because the mathematical difference in power is huge, but what it actually equates to on the screen is really not that huge. Which is why the Steam Deck is doing so well. At a relatively low price point, it's still able to play a really huge number of PC games pretty darn well. And it's one reason I'm so excited about the Switch 2 and its higher power, because it's going to be able to get in on these other third-party multi-plat releases. The graphics running on top-of-the-line hardware at max settings are kind of bumping up against a ceiling, whereas lower-end devices are getting better and better and better, and they're kind of catching up. There will be cross-gen games that run on a PS5, but also run on a PS4, but then also run on a Switch 2. So all that to say, technology is always getting better. Mobile technology is always getting better. So I think it makes a lot of sense for Sony to get back into this handheld thing if they do it this way, where it's just kind of a thing to play PlayStation games, especially if they are years away from releasing such a thing. That means that the release of this thing, PSP3 or whatever, very likely could coincide with the release of the PlayStation 6. And in the same way that right now, most PlayStation 5 games are also playable on a PS4, I imagine they could release the PlayStation 6 and advertise, hey, all of these PS6 games are also playable in, albeit a fairly stripped down, lower resolution and all that stuff, a fairly stripped down form on the PSP3. The tech will improve that much just in the next few years. It always is. If the Switch 2 next year ends up being as powerful as a PlayStation 4 Pro, well then a couple years after that, Sony could come out with a handheld, and they could price it even higher. This is going to be a luxury item. They don't have, again, they don't have to focus on that install base. They can just kind of, just like the PlayStation 5 Pro, just kind of sell it to whoever wants it. It's a luxury item, whatever. So they can price it whatever they want, which means they can make it pretty darn beefy. So yeah, if the Switch 2 is as powerful as the PS4 Pro, then the PSP 3 could be as powerful as a base PS5. I don't know. Especially if it runs at a, just like a lower resolution or whatever, because it is a handheld device. It all just seems really plausible. It seems like it would be a good business move. And who knows? They might even give it the ability to hook into the TV. I mean, honestly, why wouldn't they? Even the Steam Deck, you can buy a little thing for it. You literally just plug a HDMI to USB-C. You don't need a special dock like the Switch. You kind of just plug it in. So I don't know. Sony might just really go for Nintendo's lunch. It might really just be like, it's basically a Switch. It goes on the TV or handheld, whatever. And with technology improving all the time, now PlayStation has like this kind of two-pillar thing. I don't know how much they would actually expect to sell of a handheld like that. But like I could see it being a part of their business model moving forward, because they don't need to abandon it like they did with the Vita. They don't need to abandon it when the early numbers aren't great because, oh well, it's just a device. We're not making games for it that now aren't selling. It's just a device. We'll just keep it around. We'll upgrade it every once in a while, once or twice a generation. I could see that. I could see a Sony handheld being something that comes along and really stays. And whether or not it would end up eating some of Nintendo's lunch, I mean, this really is turning into a whole discussion. I'm gonna use it all up on a topic, Arlo. I gotta save it for a script. But I mean, basically, as we all know, Nintendo, they have rivals in a sense, but not really a ton of competition because the sales of their devices mainly come down to the sales of their first-party releases. Yes, if Sony has a really nice new handheld, that might cut into the crowd that was, gonna get a Switch 2. Oh, now this Nintendo device is powerful enough to play all these multiplats. But then, the Sony one can play the multiplats too, and it can probably play them better because it's probably going to be more powerful and more expensive. So I would say at least some of the market might be kind of poached away from the Switch 2 in that case. If everybody's got a great handheld, if every company out there has all these great handhelds, and maybe we even have a new Steam Deck by then that does give the Switch 2 less value as a multiplat platform. But again, it mostly comes down to the first party stuff anyway, so might not even be that big of a deal. I don't know, but that's the story. Might get a new PlayStation Portable in a few years, and Xbox Portable. Okay.